Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 12th of November 2025. We're here today conducting another in our series of inquiries around issues that might be coming up in the budget on the 26th of November. And as we know, there's been a lot of speculation about property taxes, everything from council tax bans to stamp duty and inheritance tax. So I'm really delighted to welcome an expert panel in front of us today. From my left to right, we have Kate Willis, who's the Property Taxes Technical Officer at the Chartered Institute of Taxation. Welcome to you, Kate. She's joined on her right, her left, my right, by Richard Donnell, Executive Director of Research at Zoopla. Welcome to you, Richard. And Professor Tim Leunig is Director of Economics at Public First Consulting, but has also advised how many governments, Professor Leunig? Several.
12 years as a senior civil servant.
Okay, so governments of different colours, or mainly of the Conservative colour in this case.
I was a civil servant, so I served the governments that had been elected by the British people.
And then our final witness is Kirstie Allsopp, who is well known, of course, from her work as a TV presenter and property expert on a number of things. It feels a bit odd seeing you on your own, Ms. Allsopp. Usually you have a sidekick, but we've got you today. So thank you very much indeed for coming. So I think it would be helpful just to dive straight in on the issue of stamp duty and really to get from each of you in turn, before we delve into some more detail, what do you think the impacts of the stamp duty system are on the market, and who are the winners and losers on stamp duty? So let me start from my left. Kate Willis, if I can start with you.
Thank you. I don't think the Institute generally doesn't take a view or analyse winners and losers particularly, but I suppose what I'd say about SDLT is, you might want to judge whether it's fit for purpose.
Stamp duty land tax for anyone who might be following.
Yes, stamp duty land tax is generally called stamp duty. So I suppose I think I try to evaluate whether it's fit for purpose. And in trying to judge that, you might think, well, what does a government want from a tax? And that might be sort of some basic criteria like ease of administration, ease of collection, not easily avoided, raises revenue, doesn't distort economic transactions or activity, and is generally acceptable to the public. And I think if you look at SDLT on those, it probably ticks 3 of those boxes, but not the other one. Not the other ones. So it's relatively easy to collect. It's quite difficult to avoid. It's a visible transaction. It's property. You can't move it. It raises revenue, but it does. I think economists are almost universally agree that it does distort economic activity.
Thank you, Richard Donnell.
Yes. So. We've had a number of reliefs over time, and I think on first-time buyers, about 40% of first-time buyers looking to buy property through our website would pay stamp duty on what they're looking to buy. That's up to nearly 80% of first-time buyers in London, with an average stamp duty bill of £16,000, which is about 3% of the value of the property, so it's quite a big hit to them. Across the rest of the south, it's about half of first-time buyers would pay stamp duty, with an average of about £5,000. But then as soon as you get out of southern England, most first-time buyers are basically nearly 90% of first-time buyers are paying nothing because of the reliefs, much smaller, less than 1% of the value of the property. For homeowners, between sort of 80 and 98% are paying stamp duty because they've got less relief than first-time buyers. And again, that's 20,000 in London, around about sort of 5 to 10,000 in the south, and probably 2,500, so down into the 1%. So I think this comes back to it's a tax that leans really heavily on London and the South East. I think what concerns me most, I think if you look at sales over $500,000, is 70% of the receipts. Sales over $1 million is 40% of the receipts. I think where it's really binding on people who are sort of more economically active in London is that band between 250 and 900. If you're in Aldershot, you're in Reading, you're in Southend, you're into 7 to 10 to 12,000 pounds just on an average property. So I think that's where it really binds, is the bandings aren't changing, and so more people are being drawn in, and then it has a big impact on labour mobility, liquidity, downsizing and buying property.
Yeah, thank you. And to our economist, Professor Tim Leunig.
Every single person in the country is a loser from stamp duty land tax, because it restricts people from moving, it restricts people from moving to opportunity to get a better job and so on and so forth. And as a result, GDP is lower, tax returns are lower, not from that thing, but from income tax, VAT, etc. And in that sense, every single person in the country is a loser. The people who are the biggest losers are generally young people because they move more often. Old people like me are on balance less bad losers than young people. I've lived in the same house since 2001. I've only owned 2 houses in my life, and I am not that young. I'm not prematurely bald. I'm bald because I'm quite old. So people like me who lead very boring, stable lives lose less than those people who lead more interesting lives, or lives that are affected by divorce, by new job opportunities, by a relative who lives a long way away, who needs assistance, and when they have to move. So although we are all losers, there are greater and smaller losers within that. But of all the taxes that should be abolished in Britain, it would be very high on the list. However, if we just abolished and didn't replace it with another property tax, all that would happen is that property prices would rise because people would be able to put down bigger deposits, and that's how the market works. So just abolishing it would simply make people like me, who own a decent-sized house in London, richer. So that would be even worse than the current position. It's better that the government gets the money than that I'm made richer.
Okay, thank you. Kirstie Allsopp.
Meg, you said very clearly that people shouldn't say something if they agreed with every word that the other committee members had said, and I agree with every word that everybody has said. I just would like to illustrate the figures that we're talking about. If you live in Wales and you have a house that is worth £550,000 and you would like an extra bedroom and perhaps a bigger garden, and you moved to a house that was worth £650,000, you would be paying £29,500 in stamp duty. You found £100 to put into the pot, you'd actually have to find an extra £35,000 to cover your moving costs. That's not right on any measure.
Okay, that's very helpful. So do you think it should be abolished?
I do.
Okay. Tim Leunig, you've said you think it should be abolished?
Yes.
Mr. Donald?
Yes.
Ms. Willis?
Again, I
don't have a
take
political
view,
position.
but
Leave the other. Okay. And so I'm going to turn to Dame Harriet Baldwin to continue.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm going to ask Professor Leunig first, because you mentioned something about mobility. And I just wondered what evidence there is out there of the impact that this is having on mobility, social mobility, and household formation, or anything else along those lines.
I don't think there's much evidence that affects household formation or that it affects the number of children or any of that aspect. But it definitely affects how many people move house. We saw that during COVID when the houses that got the stamp duty reduction, we saw a lot more moves in that than in the ones that didn't. And that was quite a nice sort of almost random experiment because in the houses that were below the bar for stamp duty, we didn't see a sudden rise. In the houses that got a reduction, we did. But as an economist, I will die in the ditch, even without a shred of evidence, to say if you make something £29,500 more expensive, it will happen less often. And the weight of economic evidence that says if you make something expensive, people do it less often, I think is overwhelming. And there's no reason why it wouldn't apply to housing.
So labour market mobility and social mobility,
yes.
but you can't point to any specific studies.
I can Google it and I can write to you afterwards to set out the evidence, because there will be some.
There will be lots of evidence.
Okay. Can I just bring in Chris Coughlin on this point?
Professor Leunig, just on the natural experiment point under COVID, is that true? Because obviously part of the incentive during COVID was it was time limited. So you've got to
Yes.
So
you wouldn't want to take the order of magnitude and say that would happen every year, but yes, we're confident that it led to more. You didn't see afterwards a big drop in those, so it isn't just that it brought forward moves, it led to genuine additional moves. And some of those will be within area, not related to job markets, but some of them will have been cross areas.
Dame Harriet.
Yes, thank you very much. Turning to Zoopla's evidence, do you have evidence in terms of the impact that stamp duty has on construction, on other aspects of the wider economy, the market for furniture, that kind of thing? Do you have any data on that?
Well, I think turnover, the number of homes that transact, does have a multiplier effect for the economy, basically. So again, you can see that it has impact on white goods spend, getting people to do DIY on your property, improving your property. So in a market where people aren't moving as often, that kind of drives less economic impact. I think to pick up on the point you've just heard, what we can see when people are looking for property on our site, if you're in southern England, many more people now are looking to move out of their local area. So the old rule of thumb, that 80% of people move within 5 miles of where they live today. If you live in southern England, nearly 40-50% of people now are looking more than 10 miles for the next property. So I think that is it's the affordability of the house and the mortgage, and the stamp duty is simply a compounding factor. If 2 to 3% of the value of the property, you're having to pay just for the privilege of buying it.
Do you think it has an effect on rental markets?
Well, I think the rental market is really driven by the ability to buy a property and the cost of buying a property. And I think the biggest challenge for first-time buyers is the mortgage payments, the impact of mortgage regulation that's increased the sort of hurdle to be able to buy a property. And then if stamp duty sits on top of that as well, you're sort of trapping a lot of people out of home ownership, and that puts big pressure on the rental market. And yes, rents are up 36% for new lets in the last 5 years, outpaced earnings growth. And so, and what we're seeing is rental inflation has really slowed now to the lowest of 4 years, and part of that reason is people are now able to, the stress rates have come down on mortgages, and so people are finding it easier, but it tends to be sort of middle to wealthier first-time buyers are finding it easier to access home ownership. There's still a lot of people who I'm sure would love to buy, but whether it's through affordability, deposit or stamp duty, couldn't buy.
Professor Leunig, you're notably nodding to all of those points. So I just wondered, in terms of rents in London, where they're so expensive, do you think they are higher because of the stamp duty land tax?
So London is a very complicated market, and if you simply abolish stamp duty, then house prices would go up, and I don't think you'd get rents coming down in the short run. In the long run, the thing that determines house prices is supply and demand. If you want lower house prices, you need to allow and permit more houses to be built, and they need to be built in parts of the country, including some of your constituencies, where prices are way higher than average. That is the long and the short of it, and everything else is second or third order. And that will affect not just house prices, but also rents. Nothing beats supply. If you care about affordability in young people, nothing.
And Ms Willis, in terms of the design of the tax, is there anything in particular that you think is particularly problematic in terms of the way the tax is designed?
I suppose it does come down to rates. The differential between the commercial rate and the residential rate is now extremely high. 5% top rate commercial, 17 or 19%, of course, for residential, if you add in the surcharge of 5% and the non-resident surcharge of 2%. And that does drive behaviour. So, for example, if somebody wants to buy a house in the country, there's a nice house, there's some garden, there's some grounds, and there's some grazing. Well, behaviourally, you might say, well, hang on, that grazing is commercial, so it's a mixed property, and therefore I want to pay only 5%, and that causes disputes and tribunal cases, and which is always a sign that there's something wrong with the system when you get a lot of cases through the courts.
Thank you. Ms Allsopp, in the real world, in terms of people making decisions about downsizing first homes, are you seeing speculation about changes to stamp duty actually affecting real world behaviour at the moment?
I'm seeing it all the time. I was very interested to hear from Tim that he'd only lived in 2 different properties. The average in a lifetime used to be 5, it's now 4. What I see is young people buying more expensive houses really than they can afford because they know they can't pay stamp duty twice. The other thing I'm seeing a lot of is people altering 2 and 3 bed houses rather than moving because the cost of moving is so high. I think we're actually damaging our first-time buyer housing stock because of stamp duty.
And do you think the speculation at the moment, though, specifically about the speculation, I will come to you, Professor Leunig. Speculation. Is speculation around stamp duty at the moment having a pronounced impact on behaviour at the
Yes, that is absolutely what I'm seeing, that people are in a panic about it.
Okay, in a panic about it.
Yes, because it has gone up and they think it could go up again. There's a lot of speculation in the press. People don't. There are these 2 figures which have been talked about, the 500,000 and the 1.5, and we know that there's activity around those 2. Tim's paper named those 2 figures, and the problem is that most people haven't seen that document and they just think, oh, if I buy something more than 500,000, something awful is going to happen, and if I buy something more than 1.5 million, something awful is going to happen. And so they are really sitting tight.
Professor Leunig,
one point that supports your case that there is distortion, and indeed yours, is that under Help to Buy, the most common size property bought by first-time buyers had 3 bedrooms. And that's just plain weird, because a 3-bedroom house, particularly a new build 3-bedroom house, is usually quite an expensive proposition. And people are doing that because then they only have to pay stamp duty once, and they only have to buy it on the first-time buyer rate. One of the big problems of the first-time buyer lower rate is it discourages you from buying a cheap first-time buyer property because you don't get much benefit, and you lose the right to the benefit later. It was a peculiarly idiotically designed tax break, that one.
And
It's also
to Richard's point earlier about white goods, when people move, they buy things. They don't buy apps, they don't buy experiences, they buy physical items, often bought from UK retailers, if not made in the UK. And that is an important economic driver. People should be able to move house cheaply and easily.
Does anyone have any quantification of what that impact is? You know, what the economic activity that occurs when someone moves? And also, I'd be very interested to hear from the Zoopla data whether the anecdotal comments we hear about how the property market at the moment is frozen, how accurate that is.
Yeah, look, it's in. We published it twice now in our House Price Index. So what we do is we track how many people are getting in touch with estate agents interested in buying a property. We can see how many properties are sale being agreed, and then we can see how many new properties being listed for sale. Over £1 million, they're all down by nearly 10% year on year since the sort of first story started appearing in August. Over 500,000, it's 4% down, and for the market below 500,000, the market's pretty flat basically. So I think, people don't need to buy property. They can afford to wait unless you're in a huge hurry. Once you've bought a property, it then takes you 5 to 6 months to actually move into it. So I think what's happened is it's just lent to a lot of people. And Christmas has almost come early because of these sort of stories, and it's just really stalled the market as people are kind of waiting and seeing. And it doesn't just stop at stamp duty. There's obviously a lot of speculation about a lot of taxes, and so I think anyone who isn't in a rush an immediate rush to buy is going to wait basically. And to build on this point, yes, I mean half of all first-time buyers looking to buy property through us want a 3-bed house outside London and Scotland, where the housing market in London and Scotland just has a lot more smaller properties basically.
It's also interesting.
I think we probably need to remember why people move house. It is often as a result of difficult circumstances, death, divorce, moving near a family member who's got dementia. All of the reasons that people move house, they're mostly not frivolous, they're important. And a good home is good health.
I was just thank you, Dame Harry. A couple of you mentioned the issue about people improving their homes rather than moving, and you were saying, particularly Ms. Allsopp, that I think it was you who said that's damaging the first-time buyer market. Is there anything you can point us to that gives sort of numerical evidence on that? Because we see it in our constituencies, especially those of us with
I'm really sorry. It would have to be Kate or Tim you spoke to. I'm the anecdotal person.
Okay. Professor Leunig.
You're going to have to email me on that one as well.
Okay, that's fine. You can write to us about
You're
that.
welcome to email me on all of these. And
Ms. Willis, I guess this is beyond your
Yes,
reach.
this is
That's fine.
Yeah.
Certainly, in expensive constituencies, we see that. So, Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you very much, Chair. And can I just say to the points that Mr. Donnell and Ms. Allsopp made about young families being prevented from moving into houses of the appropriate size, I very much see that happening in my constituency in Reading, so I appreciate your comments. To Professor Leunig, you've made a proposal for an annual national property tax, and in effect this would mean, from the perspective of the government, rather than getting a lump sum payment as it does now when people move house, often a whacking big payment, they would instead get a stream of payments into the future. Could you just comment on how this would change the fiscal position of the government and how you would come around that problem?
So first of all, let me thank Fairer Share, who funded the writing of that report. It's only fair that those who fund things get at least a little bit of credit for that, so they can have their moment of glory, and also for leaving me in peace to write what I wanted, rather than, as many funders do, trying to dictate what I would say. So there is a problem with the government accounts in that it's on a cash flow basis. And in fact, a sensible government, and a sensible committee, if you don't mind my saying so, should call for the government to state its accounts properly. So there's a whole bunch of liabilities that the government has, including all of your pensions, and indeed my pension from when I was a civil servant. And all of those should be recorded. But so too should the assets. So Richard can give you an estimate of how much capital gains tax is owed to you, I believe, on second properties. Certainly the Treasury could work that out. And you should be working out both the assets and the liabilities that are to come. And if you did that, then my proposal, which says rather than paying stamp duty up front, people should pay an annual payment, however long they live in the house, would be fiscally neutral. And I have a lot of respect for our financial markets. And I think if the government stated its fiscal accounts properly, they could see that there was no meaningful change in the government's long-term fiscal position from what I'm proposing. Now, that said, if there is still a cash flow problem, then frankly, I think we should go back to the days of tax farming. So in the olden days, like 2,000 years ago, rather than paying annual taxes, you could pay them as a lump sum up front. And I'm always surprised the government hasn't offered people of my age a 3.5%, say, discount if they pay their income tax a year in advance. That would be cheaper than issuing gilts. And given that I've used up my ISA allowance, and any sensible government would reduce the ISA allowance, that's not something on which I expect you all to agree, it's outside today, then, people like me would then have no good tax-free options. We would happily pay our income tax in advance. You just give me a bigger tax code next year. You can accelerate money relatively easily from a certain group of people who bluntly have a chunk of money and not many good investment possibilities. So if you really think there is a short-term cash flow problem for Britain, which I don't necessarily accept if we stated them properly, but yeah, you've got to get on and do it. And I think you should respect the sophisticated nature of our financial markets. Now, that's not to say I believe that we should throw away the fiscal rules or anything like that. I think those are very valuable. But if you state the position carefully and correctly, then you're not breaking any fiscal rule in any meaningful sense.
Ms. Yang.
Professor Leunig, you've been a special advisor, you've been inside
I was
the
a
Treasury.
policy advisor. I was never a special advisor. I was never political.
Apologies. You've been an apolitical policy advisor, and you've worked very closely in government. What do you think have been the obstacles to the kinds of changes in the taxation and fiscal regime that you just described?
Well, when I was in the Treasury, the obstacle was COVID, in that we spent all our time thinking about COVID. I was economic advisor to the Chancellor for the 6 months before COVID, when Sajid Javid was working towards his first budget, and it's for him, not me, to tell you what we discussed then, although I think the Right Honourable John Glenn was in the Treasury, so he may also be willing to fill you in, but I was a civil servant, so I'm not allowed to tell you what we discussed. Those are the rules. But I can tell you, I don't think I'm revealing anything to say that when I worked for Rishi Sunak, we basically worked 24/7, 365 on COVID. And that crowded out everything else, as you would expect. I'm not going to apologise for that. I'm sure Rishi wouldn't apologise for that. You all lived through COVID. You know how much it dominated. But above all, what you need is political will. On the day the Chancellor says, I wish to abolish stamp duty, now what are the options? The civil service machine will respond. But until and unless that question is asked, the civil service will not spontaneously produce papers, and nor should it. Because yes, Minister was wrong. The civil service does not spend its time trying to manipulate ministers. What the civil service, in my experience, wants is ministers who clearly lead with a consistent agenda and say what they want from us when I was one of them, and then we will do our best to respond. So what it takes is, whichever of you is the next Chancellor, whenever that vacancy comes up, to decide this matters and to go for it. And we, well, at least 3 of us, and 1 is neutral, beg you to do that. When the time comes.
Thank you, Professor Leunig. But just to be clear, is in your proposal, when you say there needs to be a change to the way that the government sets out its accounts, there seems to me to be an implication that there needs to be a change in the fiscal rules. But are you saying that there does not?
No, I'm saying that the fiscal rules should apply to the accounts correctly stated. Right. And once they're correctly stated, my proposal is fiscally neutral.
I see what you're saying. Thank you, Professor Leunig. Mr. Donnell, there have been numerous proposals for some version of a proportional property tax, such as Professor Leunig's. Some of these would require revaluation of properties either on a constant basis, rather than at the point of sale, where, of course, the sale price is a clear, visible factor. From your experience with valuations, how difficult would it be to ensure valuations are done after a sale?
I think there's 2 things. I think it is possible to value the housing market using automated valuations, statistical models. They're very good and accurate at valuing easy-to-value properties like a 3-bed house or a 2-bed house with lots of comparable evidence. I think the challenges come for the sort of tails of the market, so lower value properties in kind of less economically active, less housing liquid markets. And then also it's pretty challenging at the top of the market, and that's one of the advantages of the report Professor Leunig did, which is he's talking about let's just value things between the sort of the easy to value stuff in the middle, right, and then let's let's find out other ways of valuing. I think if you truly wanted to go for a whole market revaluation, it would take quite a lot. The statistical models do a lot of heavy lifting, but you would need a lot of human intervention as well around the edges. And then to update that every year is more challenging if you want to revalue every property. So we've made big advancements. I used our own data to look at Tim's numbers and how they all added up. And the distribution is there. But I think if you're trying to, I guess, persuade homeowners that the right value is there, and obviously you've got to remember that homeowners now got access to a lot more information. There was no information in 1991 for you to actually work to become your own sort of valuer. So again, models can help, but more effort is needed.
Thank you. And can you give an idea, just roughly, in terms of figures as to what those different low and high ends are that you think are more difficult to value?
I think it's sort of it's the bottom, maybe the bottom sort of 10% of the market by value, and then maybe the top 5 to 10% of the market by value. So it's not huge, but again,
what is that in prices?
Probably around about the top 10% of the market is probably over about 750. And then I've got the numbers here, about 750, and then maybe the bottom 10% of the market is below 100,000 or something like that. So it's...
But just to add, although that's only the top 5% of the market, it's more than 5% of the tax base.
Yeah. And go back to the point about how much stamp duty generates over £1 million from just a small proportion of sales. And again, the higher rate element of the stamp duty generates half of the stamp duty for people buying more than one property. Now that's distributed across all prices. So... but it can be done, but you can't do it quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Arn.
Yes, could I just come back to Professor Leunig, and it's great to see you here, and thank you for all the work you did in the Treasury when I was there. You've set out very clearly the problem of essentially getting a lump of money, the Treasury getting a lump of money in year one versus getting it over several years, and that you could make that neutral. But you'll also know the pressures are quite acute for all chancellors. And how do you overcome the sort of flow problem that is obviously inherent in that proposal?
So one disadvantage of stamp duty for the Treasury is it's very unpredictable. We can make in the Treasury a very good stab at estimating how much money we'll get from income tax and VAT next year, but stamp duty is one of those taxes that causes a lot of fiscal headaches because it can easily be higher or lower by a few billion in a pretty unpredictable way. So if I were the Treasury, I'd be really worried that over the next few years, a bigger and bigger proportion of tax revenues is going to come from stamp duty. And without wishing to make a party political point at all, one of the reasons that we will find that 10 billion is bluntly not enough headroom is the erratic nature of the tax base. So if I were the Treasury, I would say that a fiscally neutral annual tax is a much more reliable source of income because it's based on past sales than a transaction tax. So I would really, if I were the Treasury, be wanting to move away from an annual tax. And I fully accept that it's hard in the short run. And that's why, as I say, I think the best way is
move away from a one-off.
Yes, move away from a one-off because it's so unpredictable. Okay. And when things are unpredictable, you get a few months of bad news and suddenly the press is full of stories that the Chancellor will have to raise taxes. And at that point, as work by Public First and others have shown, people, the general public get scared. They don't know what tax is going to go up and they start saving money. That then depresses the economy and unemployment starts to rise. And that is surely part of the story of the last 6 months. Now, I don't want to tell you that unemployment would not have risen in the last 6 months if we'd have had an annual tax rather than a stamp duty. That will be taking it too far. But the basic point holds. That an unstable tax system is destabilising for the economy.
Okay, I want to ask all of you about your assessment of the impact it will have in terms of people who are asset rich and cash poor. And obviously we could discuss the different rates and how they're set. But the inference of your proposal is that there'll be a regular, reliable annual source of income for the Treasury. But for some people that would be an alarming additional expense cost, right? Please explain.
Let me clarify. My proposal was only going to come in for future house sales. So let me imagine that I retire to Salisbury.
Be most welcome.
Thank you. I wouldn't pay stamp duty in Salisbury, but instead I would pay an annual tax that would be calibrated in net present value terms to be the same as the stamp duty. So if I wanted, I could pretty much put the stamp duty in the bank and pay the annual tax from that. So no existing people. The lady opposite me, where I live in Surbiton, whose house must be worth more than £1 million and who has lived there, I think, for 64 years, is not under any threat whatsoever. But the person who buys her house next, they will have to pay an annual tax. But because they won't have paid stamp duty, there is no threat to the asset rich and cash poor. And indeed, I designed it because your question is very valid.
Thank you very much. May I turn to Ms. Allsopp on this, because you might have seen different reactions.
Well, you'll have to forgive me if I'm being really stupid about this. But when I read through it, it seemed to me that which they won't, but if your proposal came into place on the 26th of November, someone who had bought a large property last year would then stay in it for a much longer time, because until they moved, they wouldn't be paying. So if they'd just paid stamp duty, they might move again in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, but they could just decide not to. And they wouldn't be paying. Is that correct?
That is correct. So for them, the position is the same as
Do it through the chair, please, just so we can all see you.
Sorry, apologies. I know, I look gorgeous. For them, it is the same as the current system under stamp duty, in that there is an incentive to stay in your house a long time.
So
but once you have moved after that, I have got rid of the incentive to stay in the same place forever. So it takes longer under my system to move to a freer and more liberal housing market.
Okay.
That's the price I paid.
Ms. Allsopp, do you want to
represent retrospective?
That was a valuable exchange, but would you like to develop your point further?
So I am correct in what I thought, and that does disturb me deeply. There are many elements of the report which I agree with, but that one about how if you bought a house, you would now make it your forever home does not alter the situation which is currently created by very high stamp duty at the top end of the market. As I said, I'm the anecdotal person, not the data person. But my mother moved to London when I was 17, and in the 30 years that she was alive, she had 7 homes. She bought and sold all the time. She was a little micro-economy, and every time she did that, she had new kitchens and upholstered furniture and had curtains made and employed all sorts of different people, most of them small British businesses. I have been in the same area, in the same home for 20 years. And obviously in my job I see stuff all the time. And there have been lots of times I would have liked to move. But in recent years, the stamp duty basically swallowed up my entire refurbishment budget. I'm worried that under this proposal, the top end of the market will continue not to move, and the loss of business to small but very valuable often southern-based businesses would be quite great.
Thank you. So, Professor Leunig, it's worth perhaps going back to that point, because the current system, as Ms. Allsopp and others have set out, has a massive disincentive for people to not have a big lump of a stamp duty to pay. But they also now, under your proposal, would have the opportunity to avoid an annual tax in perpetuity, thereby in similar effect of actually saying, I'm not going to move, and the economic consequences of that. How do you address that?
So one thing I used to say to my ministers is to quote Paloma Faith, do you want the truth or something beautiful? And the answer in this case is there is no beautiful answer. Right. You have to choose. If you apply this retrospectively, I apologise in a moment. If you apply it retrospectively to the person who moved the new annual tax retrospectively to the person who moved house last week, then someone will say quite rightly that's unfair. They're paying twice. If you don't, however, apply it retrospectively, as Ms. Allsopp says, they have an incentive not to move. And you just have to choose one of those. That is the truth. There is no beautiful answer to that.
I think what you're conceding is that your proposal does not offer us a solution to that problem.
It does in the medium term. Because in the medium term, once the house has been sold, it's then paying the annual tax whoever buys it and whoever sells it. And at that point, you're in the new equilibrium where I think we would both agree people have the incentive to move, because the additional annual tax from moving to a house of 500 to one of, I think it was 600 you said, would be trivial. So people would still move. So in the medium term, the problem you identify is solved by my scheme, but it would only be in the medium term. You can accelerate it by forcing people to double pay, and that is a political choice for you.
Okay. And could I just ask you finally, there are differences across the United Kingdom, and I'm sure you will have considered this. What would be your solution to make this sort of transparently plain and understandable when people live on the borders of Wales and England or whatever?
So I've always strongly believed in devolution, and as someone who has never lived in Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland, I have never wanted to speak for those places. So contrary to your confidence in me, I have not thought about it, because I think it is best for them to think about solutions for their communities that they know far better than I ever will. Other than to say, I want to give them the right to implement the solutions they think will work for them.
I'm sure they'll be reading your report, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Luke Murphy, MP.
Thank you. Professor Leunig, I just wanted to pick up on a proposal that John Muhlbauer has made around this exact issue, around the idea that if you have just moved and you've paid stamp duty, that you may the government could offer a tax credit against future annual property tax liabilities. I just wondered whether that's something that you'd considered as a mechanism.
It could do. So John taught me microeconomics a long time ago when I was a grad student, and I've remained in contact with him for many years. I'm concerned about John's...
Can we just use full names?
I'm concerned about Professor Muhlbauer's proposal, in that it seems to me to be relatively complicated, and I'm not sure whether people want to take on a sort of debt or credit like that, but it would be worth exploring. It is the sort of thing that a government, when a Chancellor said to the civil service, it's the sort of thing the civil service should go out and run focus groups with people and see whether there will be interest in taking it up. If there is, it might be an elegant solution. But if people say, whoa, that looks a bit crazy, I don't like that, then it will be a solution that wouldn't work in practice. But we'd want to go out and road test it with.
Thank you for now, Mr Murphy. Bobby Dean MP.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I already shared with colleagues I paid a stamp duty bill on Friday, so this is extremely tricky for me. And we did do exactly what you described, Ms Allsopp, which is try to make a bigger step to avoid paying it twice in the next 5 years. And I hope nothing does change next year in the next couple of weeks, because I'll be quite upset. I want to move on to reforms to council tax, but before I do that, just triggered a thought from Luke Murphy MP's question there. There is another proposal out there from the Tony Blair Institute about effectively giving a 20-year loan to people to pay off stamp duty. Any thoughts from panel on that? I can see, Richard Donnell, you were sort of indicating you might have an answer on that.
Look, I think it's a good idea. It's just the complexity of just how do you manage it. I think that's the challenge. It's adding complexity into the system. I think anything that everyone's in violent agreement that anything to reduce the stamp duty bill, to reduce that initial cost, to spread it over time, get more people moving, support economic growth is a good idea. And there's lots of ideas around this, but I'm not an expert in the complexity of how you would roll that out for potentially 1 million transactions a year, ongoing, moving forward, to sort of collect all the revenue, unless you sort of do it through self-assessment tax or something like that.
May not be worth the pain. And Professor Leunig, did you want to come in on that?
The Tony Blair government achieved many very useful things, but it also created a lot of complexity on things like PFI that frankly were always too good to be true. When we
just focus on the
I think just say, as somebody who has benefited from the neurological department at St George's Hospital that was a PFI, I'm very grateful that he did.
Okay. But can we focus on the property taxes?
In general, it is better to focus on plain vanilla solutions than complicated ones. Anything that seems too good to be true usually is. And that one, at least on a first reading by me, looked too good to be true.
Mr Dean.
Okay, I want to move on to council tax, and I know, Professor Leunig, you've got a proposal on that too, so we'll come back to it. But first, could I hear from Ms Willis about the experience in Wales, because they have actually tried to revalue council tax and what the experience has been there?
Yes, absolutely, and are going to revalue in 2028. So they have undertaken consultations and set out a roadmap and a strategy and undertaken all sorts of educational initiatives to arrive at that point. I think it hasn't been an entirely easy process. So the Welsh Government have said that revaluation will be on a revenue neutral basis. And it was interesting to see that in some of the responses to those consultations that the public just didn't accept that. They thought it was revenue raising. And I think council tax is generally quite an unpopular tax, isn't it? Because because of its salience and visibility. You pay it, and it's a dry tax charge. You pay it out of your income or your savings. There's no proceeds generated to pay it, and so it is a difficult one to reform. But I think with what Wales has done successfully is they've consulted, they've tried to take the public with them, they've set out a roadmap, and they've researched and produced independent research on the consequences, and they've taken the Institute of Fiscal Studies.
Just ask a quick follow-up on that. Then you said there seems to be some sort of public perception issue with it, but has there been many sort of technical challenges of the valuations as well? Have you seen that in your sector?
Well, I think maybe that's perhaps what is one element which has changed. I mean, we've seen eminent economists and institutes put forward proposals for reform of property tax over many years, and it hasn't really happened, has it? And one of the barriers to property tax reform is valuation, and the difficulty of valuation. It's costly, it's disruptive, it's quite a slow process. But I think perhaps now that we have these new automated mass appraisal models, and that's what is being developed by the Valuation Office in conjunction with the Welsh Government to bring about the valuation in Wales. And to the extent that they are cheaper, quicker, and I would bow to Richard here, but that maybe is one barrier which will enable or at least will reduce a barrier to long-term property tax reform.
Mr. Donald, I wondered if you could... I will come to you. Mr. I wondered if you could build on that point, because I think actually the existence of things like Zoopla is probably giving confidence to politicians that actually valuations are very easy now, because they're telling me all the time via email what my house is worth at any moment in time, right? But you said actually it's a bit more complicated than that. So can you explain in a bit more detail what those complications are, and how regularly you think it is reasonable for a government to expect to be able to revalue under a new system?
Because back to your colleague, I think it's where a property is very homogeneous, lots of similar properties around it, and the housing market is liquid, and there's no special features on the property. It's quite easy for a computer to value that property, basically. So again, the classic three-bed semi surrounded by a sea of three-bed semis where lots of liquidity is, and if you know good information about the property, you can value with a reasonable degree of accuracy. I think when you get to the mill house in mid-Wales, or the castle overlooking the cliffs, or you get to a particularly kind of maybe deprived area, lack of economic growth, very low levels of housing activity, it just gets harder. It's not impossible, you can value the properties, but I think that's where there's either a blend of statistical models and data with a human getting involved to sort of check the numbers. And then there will be a cohort of properties where you just need a surveyor to go round and put a valuation on it. But just as statistical models have an error range of how accurate they are, human beings have an error range as well. A human surveyor suffers from a lack of information just as much as a model does, basically. So, as I said earlier, I think 50, 60, 70% of properties should be relatively easy to value with a statistical model, the sort of the very typical homogeneous
If I could
properties.
just push you on the frequency. So you say the bulk of it would be reasonably easy to do, but we would need this more effortful work as well. I mean, under a new system or just a revision of the current system, how frequently do you think we could revalue properties?
Look, we value the housing market every month. You could, but it's all about sort of are you using then indexation to move values forward? So do you have a local house price index for Swansea 3-bed houses or for Surbiton 3-bed houses, and you move it forward? So the data's there to build indices to move them forward in line with the market, or you might want to use another index. So I think that's a sort of a policy and sort of implementation choice, basically. But it is possible to value more regularly. I think it's the point about retaining the confidence of consumers. Will they be allowed to challenge? Again, I read the similar papers in Wales. It's amazing. Even people who are going to save money think that actually they're going to end up less well off. So it's how do you build that trust with consumers that they're sort of comfortable with how the values are set.
Ms. Allsopp, I know you've been keen to come in, but can I ask you an additional question as well,
yes,
that you can answer within your answer, which is how much council tax bears on people's decision making about where to move? Because obviously different authorities will have very different rates, and whether or not you've seen much evidence of council tax changing people's decisions.
I've seen very little evidence of council tax making a difference. It is one of those people that they factor it in, and that actually people more often ask about insulation, heating costs. All energy-related costs seem to disturb them more than council tax. Can I ask you a question? Is that allowed?
Go through
the show. I was interested in how long it took you to move house, because one of the things we haven't spoken about, but I did want to address briefly.
We won't ask Mr. Bean to answer a question,
No,
but
okay.
if you can
Yes.
use it to illustrate the point.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's just that there is a consultation at the moment to reforms to the buying and selling process that we have in the country. We've gone from an average of 8 weeks from acceptance of offer to completion to well over 20 weeks. It has completely bunged up the system. It is not just stamp duty that makes people reluctant to move house more frequently. It is the fact that it is so complicated and hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we had the home sellers packs that was introduced or attempted to be introduced under a previous Labour government. So there's been lots of attempts to deal with this and it hasn't really worked. But we take the point, but today we've got to focus a bit on the tax. Mr. Dean,
I very briefly say it took far too long. It did take since May. Professor Leunig, I'm sure you've been itching throughout this discussion because you've also got a proposal for annual local tax. And I wondered if you could just explain that to us and if you could specifically address why you've got these elements in it of a cap of properties valued at $500,000 and a floor of what people would pay under that
I'll
system.
add one thing to Richard's answer and everybody else's, which is if we got rid of stamp duty land tax, we'd have more transactions, and that would mean more data for Richard, and then his estimate of all other prices would be more accurate. So doing it sequentially, stamp duty first and then council tax revaluation would have some merit. If you are in one of the poorer parts of the country and you just have a proportional property tax, that part of the country will run out of money. So if you take the classic North Lancashire textile towns, I wrote my PhD on those, places like Burnley and Blackburn or Barnsley over the border would have a very low tax base. Those are still places where you can buy a house for 30,000 quid. And if you're paying 0.5% of 30,000 quid, you're paying 150 quid a year in council tax. The council cannot survive on 150 quid. And even if they get a bigger grant from central government, the local council then has no democratic legitimacy because they have no tax raising powers. And that's why I said there should be a minimum payment of £800 for council tax, which I think nobody would be a loser from that. I don't think Band A is below £800 anywhere in the country. And that means that those sorts of places have a tax base, and that's why I went for a minimum. That also means, based on my back-of-the-envelope calculations, that you don't need to value any property under £180,000, because whatever its value, they're still going to be paying £800. Similarly, by having a top end of £500,000, I don't have to value any properties beyond that. So hopefully I have picked all the houses that Richard can value reliably in the middle, and that was my intention. Because I trust Richard to do what Richard says he can do, and I trust Richard when he says there are some things he can't do. And the 500,000 doesn't mean that rich people get away scot-free, because they would be paying the annual tax to central government on the amount over 500, but I would fix that at their purchase price and then just index it every year. So I only have to value 180 to 500,000.
Can I just be clear on who pays this tax? Is it anybody who lives in the property or is it only the owner?
I would do it on the owner, but that's for the... I'm not wedded to that.
Okay.
That's for the prosaic view that I think it would increase collection rates and reduce collection costs. And older people, including myself, will remember that the rates was levied on owners rather than occupiers. Now, we would expect rents to go up, don't get me wrong. This is not a get-out-of-free card for renters, but I think it would lower the collection costs for councils. And that's a good thing.
And just final question from me, given that you have served under different governments, why do you think it is that governments continually bottle this question of property taxation?
Well, the experience of property tax reform has been pretty awful. I mean, nobody's ever won a vote reforming local taxation. I mean, even in Wales, which is doing something relatively modest, all sorts of... No, I'm allowed to say shit, aren't I? You're not, but I am. All sorts of shit has hit the fan. Whereas when you think back to...
politically too difficult, it's basically.
It's politically too difficult. Okay. And that's not just a fear. When we had the poll tax, that was an absolute disaster. Then when we replaced poll tax, that was also a disaster, and it raised a lot less revenue, and central government had to put a lot more money into local government. Ken Clarke put VAT on fuel, and then that was problematic. So, no, I can understand why politicians are often, in the nicest possible way, prudent stroke gutless, depending on your view of politicians.
Yes. I'm going to bring in Luke Murphy MP then, Mr Grady.
Thank you. I should have declared earlier that, just for the sake of declaration, I'm an unpaid member of the Independent Housing Policy and Delivery Oversight Committee, which does do work on taxation. Professor Leunig, you're right in that William Waldegrave, I think, said that he made one of the most tedious subjects so interesting that he became the cause of widespread riots and the cause of the defeat of a great Prime Minister. I just wondered, what are the measures that you would put in place to smooth the introduction of a new system, given the difficulties and given the international experience that shows that actually reform isn't uniquely difficult to the UK?
Two things I would do is say that anybody whose house is worth more than 500,000 will typically be a winner under my reforms to council tax, but I would prevent them being a winner until the house is sold. And that gives me a chunk of money that means that other people are not forced to pay too much. The second thing I would do is hire Richard or hire Stephen Aldridge, the very already hired excellent chief analyst in the housing department, to actually work out the results band by band and house by house to see how many winners and losers there are and to see what extent they're winners and losers. So I wrote the first national funding formula for schools. And that's exactly what we did. We came up with a national funding formula for schools that minimised the change from the current position to make it politically palatable. So until about 2016, we had no national funding formula for schools. They were just paid on ad hoc background figures that had lasted forever. And that was terrible. But rather than going for a big thing, we went for the smallest changes and then we gradually improved it over time. So I would be very, very incremental. People don't rebel over a tenner.
And I guess to Kate Willis, you talked earlier about stamp duty around some of the principles, and one of them was around the acceptability of taxation. Is one of the issues that we have with council tax the fact that we can't make up our minds whether it's a consumption tax, a property tax, a services tax, and how much do you think that feeds into, because that feeds into the acceptability of whether the public think it's a legitimate tax?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And the acceptability, culture matters, doesn't it? It's the social context. Council tax has been with us for a long time. It's been set at the 1991 values for such a long time, and it gets entrenched, doesn't it, in people's views. And you're right. I think I agree. If you want a strategy for long-term reform, you've got to set out the objectives. You've got to tell the story. You've got to set out what the government is trying to do. And council tax presents a little bit of a problem in that, because it is a hybrid tax. On the one hand, it's a tax to collect services for local government, and on the other it's taxed by reference to property value. So what is it trying to do? Is it trying to tax property value, or is it trying to collect money? And I think those objectives are confusing, and they are contrary, aren't they? If you look at the single person discount for people living in the house on their own, that makes entire sense from a services perspective, but it makes no sense from a good use of the existing housing stock.
And then can I just ask about who should be levying the tax? Because international experience, from what I understand, suggests that actually most of it might be collected nationally in other countries, but it's levied locally. And should we accept a lot of variation in council tax if we're allowing it to be set locally, or should it be? I appreciate you have a particular proposal, but interested in who should be levying the tax.
Well, I think that's. Well, I think it's interesting there that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what council tax is, what it pays for, and who, so local government is quite financed by other sources, not exclusively by council tax, and that's not well understood about what council tax pays for. So when you put up council tax, people tend to say, well, why aren't I getting more services? Why aren't those potholes mended? And in fact, it isn't the main source of local government funding.
What is a scandal, and I think it's a widely understood scandal amongst economists, is that there's 5 or 6 inner London boroughs, including, I'm afraid, that of the chair of this committee, whose councils get a disproportionately large grant that means they have exceptionally low council tax. And that variation, I think, is indefensible. But it's obviously defensible if people in one area want to vote for higher.
I wouldn't say that, Mike, the council tax in Hackney is exceptionally low.
Oh, I'm sorry, I apologise. I thought you were in Islington. I apologise. Mea culpa.
I'm sure they would think that. I think Wandsworth is the one that's known for being low.
Well, Wandsworth is most famous, but it's not only Wandsworth. It includes Westminster, it includes Chelsea, Kensington and Chelsea and so on. But obviously, if one area wants to vote for higher taxes and have better services, that should be their democratic right. And that I would celebrate, but it should be from a basis of a much clearer and more equal redistribution formula. And as I say, inner London is, excluding Hackney, which is not inner London for these purposes, is disproportionately well funded.
Ms. Allsopp.
I live in Kensington and Chelsea. About 3 years ago, there was a garbage strike, a dustman strike in Edinburgh when I was up there. And I was talking to the taxi driver about it, and he told me what he paid in council tax and was furious about the strike. And I was absolutely horrified to discover we paid the same amount, unless that taxi driver lives in a very considerable house in Edinburgh. That isn't right.
Okay, thank you. That's a good point. Mr. Murphy.
I guess my final question to both Professor Leunig and other members of the panel is that should any reform take any account of income, someone's income, as the current system does in ways, and secondly, what deferral mechanisms would you put in place given the income challenge for someone paying an annual rate?
Who's that to? Miss Willis?
Miss Willis first.
Yes, I mean, the existing council tax reduction scheme provides support for low-income tax households, and that would really, that you'd have to look at something similar, I think, to support, well, you'd have to provide some support to owner-occupiers who are in that same position. And, you know, even on a minimum payment of £800, I mean, people who are on very low incomes, that would be an unaffordable amount.
You would never want someone living in a large family home whose... I spoke to a lady recently whose husband had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He was given 4 weeks to live. She sold their business to look after him for 4 weeks, and he lived for 2 years. And she got through every penny they owned in those 2 years. Now, if she was living in a family house, I don't want her to have a forced sale because she can't afford £2,000 in council tax, and I doubt anyone thinks any different. So yes, there is always a place for a benefit system, but it's usually better to do it via the benefit system than have some very complicated rules that mean council tax is actually an income tax in disguise.
Okay, I think that's so good. That's where the hair's running, but I'll bring Mr. John Grady in to bring us back on track.
Professor Leunig, just a clarification point. You mentioned that houses over $500,000 would be indexed. So you wouldn't take account of improvements or anything like that. You'd just have a straight indexation. What inflation rate would you pick for that? Would it be a property-based inflation rate or CPI or RPI?
I would use CPI, because that way when you buy a house, you can know what you're going to be on the hook for. Whereas at the moment, if you go to somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge, so if you go to East Oxford, you will find Church Cowley Road. It's a really bog-standard road full of late 1930s small terraced houses that were once upon a time bought by blue-collar workers that are now worth a fortune. And I don't want that blue-collar worker who worked picking up the bins or whatever, is now a pensioner, suddenly forced to pay some whopping great tax because of house price inflation. I want them to know where they are.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grady. Just on the valuation, I mean, you talked, Ms. Allsopp, earlier about the improvement, people improving rather than moving.
Yes.
So it'd be interesting to just hear some examples of when you've seen, because one of your programmes, you have I think it's you who persuades people to stay,
yes.
And your colleague who persuades people to move.
Yes.
And you always have a valuation, but that's an evaluation done by an estate agent. So a couple of things is how much people are adding in value, if people could answer that, and also particularly I think to Mr. Donnell, how would you work out what improvements were worth? Because basement conversions, for instance, in my constituency, would not be visible necessarily from the roadside. You can do a drive-by valuation. So Ms. Allsopp, do you want to add anything here?
I think the valuation issue is particularly difficult because you cannot tell from the street. You just can't. All sorts of things have happened all over the country. That particularly the back extensions, knocking through all sorts of things that people have done. I mean, I can go and see a house, a semi-detached house, and there can be as much as £250,000 difference in the value of those two properties on the market because of the work that people have done.
Do you think there's any way that could be captured practically? Without, well, I suppose, home visits, but apart from that,
the only way that I could see would be to, lean on people and really require them to be very honest about the work that they've done and provide. I mean, I think AI is out there, and if you have to provide photographs of all the rooms in your house, I suspect that I suspect that it will be possible quite soon to make real judgments on that.
So every time you market it for sale or for rent and those pictures are on Mr. Donnell's website,
yes,
that would be Mr. Donnell. So I bring you in then on this. So is this a way of solving the valuation issue?
It could be. I think you're right. Home improvements only tend to come to light when someone lists their property for sale, and then you get the new floor plan and the new layout. So that is a challenge. But equally now, the technology of aerial imaging, seeing the footplate of a dwelling. So what really drives the value of a property is square footage and space, basically. If you've got to add space to a property, you can make the kitchen as nice as possible and the bathrooms as nice as possible to your personal taste. It won't necessarily have that much of an impact. But if you add a loft conversion, if you do a big extension on the ground floor, that's what really drives the space. And I think the data is coming through to do that. And again, I think as part of any valuation exercise, and again, it's how much the political choices or the policy choices to let people sort of submit their own information or maybe upload their own information, so that actually people get kind of, again, more engaged on making sure the valuation is accurate.
I'll bring Ms Willis and then back to Ms Allsopp.
I was just going to point out that in Ireland they have a local property tax, and that is done by self-assessment, which is interesting.
Indeed, I'm familiar with that system, and for a lot of properties that are passed down through families, there's no way of them never being marketed, so it's an interesting one. Ms Allsopp.
I think we've got to be very careful of doing anything which deters people from improving their properties. We rely on owners to improve our housing stock. Without that, it wouldn't happen. And we have had situations in the past, particularly in the 70s, where people actively devalued their properties to avoid taxes. You know, we all know about the window tax. We've all read about that. But until
for those who perhaps don't know, because not everyone following, maybe
well,
just
I think
to explain.
It's as we know, the window tax was a tax that was imposed, and as a result, owners of properties...
We're talking a couple of hundred years ago.
Yeah.
I'm just being clear to anyone watching that this is not a proposal for the Chancellor in the budget, as far as we're aware.
And as a result, people bricked up windows. We don't want to have any taxes which lead to alters in behaviour and discourage people from investing in their homes. Different people do different things. Some people buy expensive cars, expensive handbags, go on expensive holidays. Others save really hard and do a lot of work on their houses. I was with a couple recently in Newcastle, and Mark, who's the co-owner of the house, turned to me and said, I didn't know how hard it was to wash up in the bath. And for a year, he had no kitchen because they saved up £20,000 every year for 5 years to do work to their house. I don't think they should have to pay a higher tax than their next door neighbour who might not have spent the money improving their home.
Okay, thank you. And Mr Donald, just on the valuation, so who should value them? I mean, you've got HMRC might have a stake in this, surveyors, AI, estate agents, or the homeowner. I mean, how do you get a consistent valuation?
I think, as you said...
How can we trust, I suppose, what's on Zoopla's website?
Well, I think what you need is you need a very good database of property descriptions and attributes that describe...
That would also be, so when you've got a licensing arrangement in a local authority, those plans as well as sales plans. Yeah.
And the government's house price index has pulled together a lot of data about property description. You've got the valuation office agency, council tax base. So there's a lot of data about the stock of property. There's obviously a huge amount of data about the achieved prices of property from land registry and other sources.
Is an achieved price the real value of a property? Because the properties can go up and down, schools change, transport links improve or degrade. That can have an impact.
And then what you also have with a model is an indexation. So to value a property today, you might use historic values, but you bring them forward to today's date, and then look at the attributes to then drive the valuation. So I think, again, it probably would be, if it was done, it seems sensible that it was driven. I think the Valuation Office Agency have got an automated valuation model, probably led by government. And then I think when it comes to how much external input, I think you probably would use chartered surveyors. And again, if you were really progressive, you would probably think about letting consumers, if you were really ambitious, put their floor plans up or submit the sort of real size and floor plate of their dwelling and how many beds there were. Because I think getting consumer engagement is a key part of that, basically.
Yeah, maybe people have already gone down the path of giving up their privacy by listing their properties on website. I just want to finally, before I go back to Ms Yang, go to you, Ms Allsopp. I mean, some properties will have probably gone down in value
Yes.
because of COVID. I believe has had an impact. Do you want to explain what you've seen?
I think
Ms Yang.
there are two different things. Firstly, I think we come back to the previously discussed problem at the top end of the market. Rural properties in England and Wales and Scotland, larger ones, have dropped enormously in value in the last 18 months for various reasons, but this isn't something, the data is not available yet because in many cases they haven't sold. I was recently told by an estate agent in Dorset that he had 46 properties on the market and 6 viewings. There are a number
What sort of price bracket are we talking about?
The absolute top price bracket. We're talking
This is
1.5 and above.
Okay.
But homes in that bracket have recently really dropped. They're just not selling. And the problem is, a property, as you just said, is only worth what people are prepared to pay for it. So valuation is a difficult issue, unless, as Richard said, you have a street with a lot of similar houses. Then it is much easier. So I think you have to be careful not to put yourself in a situation where you have a lot of appeals for revaluations from people who can afford to appeal, because they are looking at a property which might have been worth 3.5 million and is now worth 2 million, and they do not want to pay the differential on that. And I think that the second thing, which we were saying earlier about people altering their properties and not wanting to pay for that, is if we're having yearly revaluations, that is a real problem. I can't say that strongly enough. We need people to invest in their homes and not be disincentivised from doing that.
Okay. What about the lower end of the market? Have you seen anything there about valuations that have shifted oddly?
No, I haven't, thank God. I haven't.
Okay. Mr. Dean?
I just want to come in on that exact point, because I mean there are some economists that say, well, actually you shouldn't be trying to value the property but value the land itself. And I don't know if Professor Leunig, you wanted to come in on that point, if it was possible to just sort of pull out the value of the land rather than the value of the property that's on it. Would that make a difference?
Well, that will be even harder, because basically you have to start with the sale price of the house, then work out what the house is worth, which requires everything, and then it's a subtraction. So that definitely wouldn't be easier. Can I answer your previous question on very low value properties? Those can be really hard. We don't really have many in the UK at the moment because we're so short of housing. But if we go back to the days, the start of the last Labour administration, so the very late 1990s, there were parts of the country where you could buy a house for 50 quid in the pub. There were places in Newcastle where that was true, where houses sold for £50, £500, £5,000. The same was true in Liverpool. That's why we had Pathfinders that came along. And in that sort of world, what something is worth really is, that's just impossible. I wouldn't want to go there. And hence my £800 minimum, because I really don't think you'll ever get a good valuation.
One question for a slightly separate, but came up earlier before I passed to Ms Yang. You talked about your proposal being fiscally neutral. So and we also discussed the political challenges of delivering this. So, simple question: why bother?
Well, the government should bother because council tax. So the government should definitely get rid of stamp duty, because that's a proper economic problem. If you get rid of stamp duty in the way that I suggested, and you have an annual tax above 500,000, then you can end up with a pretty big dry tax, as you said, that people have to pay. If they have to pay all of council tax plus all of my new annual tax, that looks like a pretty ugly annual tax that I didn't think was politically viable. And therefore, I wanted to reform council tax in order that it didn't go above 500,000 and delivered a stable basis for councils. So it's a knock-on effect of what my motivation was, a knock-on effect on council tax from stamp duty, because stamp duty is genuinely reducing the rate of economic growth. Okay. The other thing, if I can say on this, is that if the government wants to make people like me poorer, and broadly speaking, I think, like everyone around this table, richer than average, I have wider shoulders than average, to use the Chancellor's thing, then hitting me with income tax is a very bad idea, because I can always choose to work less. Whereas hitting me on property tax or other ways doesn't reduce my incentive to work. And I'm not the only person who thinks like that. And again, to give declaration to people who funded me, 30 Percy, a philanthropic organisation, have funded Stonehaven, for whom I've worked, that's done a lot of work on the fact that people do prefer to be taxed less on work, which they see as contributing to society, versus in other ways. So again, I think there are reasons, political and economic, to think about reforming property tax, because something's got to go up very soon.
Thank you very much. Yuan Yang, MP.
Thank you. To Ms Willis and then to Professor Leunig, we've just been discussing stamp duty land tax, which is charged when you buy a house. I want to turn to capital gains tax, which is charged on some properties when some owners sell a house. Primary residences are currently exempted. Ms Willis, could you speak on the pros and cons of equalising capital gains tax on property with income tax?
Well, one of the key sort of issues there is indexation and the extent to which you tax the inflationary element of a gain. So one of the justifications I think given in the past for keeping the differential is because otherwise you will tax that inflationary element. So it's a sort of proxy for not doing that.
Yeah, but with indexation, if there was indexation to inflation or to some other index, what would you see as the pros and cons?
Well, again, that's probably not within our particularly. I think that's a political decision for the government rather than for our institute.
Sure, of course. Professor Leunig, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
So, as a pure economist, of course, I think we should go back to the old days when you taxed owner-occupiers on their imputed revenue stream from renting their own house to themselves. But I'm honest enough to admit that is never going to happen. It was Schedule A back before whatever it was, 1966. You should never tax inflation. Obviously, in that sense, I'm a Nigel Lawson fan. He did not believe in levying CGT on inflationary gains in anything else. In countries that do have CGT on owner-occupied property, they always allow for rollover relief. So if you sell one house and buy another, you don't have to pay the CGT, because otherwise people would have an incentive never to move, and that would be a bad idea. Most countries that do it also allow relief if you put the money into a pension. And that facilitates people buying a house when they're young and not putting much money into their pension, and then when they're my age and their children leave home, they then sell the house and put it into a pension. And I can see merit in that as well. Actually, I think we should think a lot more about merging pensions and houses. There's a huge bill coming up for Parliament because more and more people are going to be in the private sector when they retire. And that's going to cost us a fortune in universal credit. So, but overall, all I've got to say is, I'd love you to be brave politicians, but CGT on owner-occupied property? Blimey. If you call for that, I will respect your bravery.
Can I just clarify two separate things that I think I've got confused in this discussion? One is the discussion of broadening the CGT tax base, which in this case, as Professor Leunig mentioned, would include or could include not exempting main residences, i.e. charging CGT on main residences, which is not the case. But the question I actually wanted to ask about was about raising the rate so that's equalised with income tax rather than broadening the base. I was wondering, Professor Leunig, if you wanted to
yes, as an economist, I believe all income should be taxed the same. However, defining income as excluding any inflationary gains. Okay. And again, if my memory serves me right, that was the system in the Nigel Lawson era where CGT rates were the same as income. The only exception to that is CGT tends to come along in clumps. So you almost always end up as a 40% taxpayer in the time you get your CGT lump, whereas income tends to be smoothed out. So there's an issue to think about there. But in general, dividends, savings income, income from earnings, CGT, they're all income if you're an economist.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Catherine Weston.
Thank you, Chair. What's the wider impact of even minor changes to CGT? I'm referring, of course, to just that the look and feel and that sense of confidence in the property market.
Who's that to, Ms. Allsopp?
Yes.
Ms. Allsopp.
I mean, as far as CGT on main residences go, I can't even grasp the impact that would have. But it comes back to my earlier point of we shouldn't do anything to discourage people from moving, and we shouldn't do anything to discourage people from improving, and that would do both.
Okay. Ms. West?
And perhaps... And
Ms. Willis.
I mean, there are some administrative challenges to taxing main homes. You know, people, it's that principal private residence relief has been in place since 1965. People just don't keep records of their costs and improvements and that sort of thing. So there would be some clear... And if you had to do that, you'd have to look at uplifting a base cost, changing the base cost from 31st of March 82 probably up to a current value. I mean, it's fairly fraught with... And if you set it at a for houses over only a certain amount, you'd have some cliff edges, some quite severe cliff edges there. And I think this sort of also goes to the point about looking at the tax system holistically, because if you change one element of the tax system, it has an effect on the other. If you tax CGT or high value properties that are subject to CGT, that's going to reduce transactions at that level, and then that has an effect on STLT revenues. You need to look at it holistically, I think.
Ms. West, did you want something?
I just wanted to...
Ms. Allsopp's itching to get in again.
As someone who's just paid CGT on a gift to a child, and I had to work out all the different money that I'd spent on that flat improving it, I know how complicated it was for someone who's very experienced and keeps quite good documents. Most people don't have an accountant. They are PAYE. So for the average person to do that would be great for the accountancy industry, but it really would be very, very difficult.
Could I return to the council tax and the general other taxes question with the I think it was the professor who mentioned the single person's concession and how that sort of encourages people to stay in a big house on their own. I was also just wondering, could you just explain a little bit more about the concept of a residence tax as opposed to the, because I'm thinking of other places where rates are payable and landlords have to pay rates, and then it sort of protects renters, which we know are becoming a bigger part of the market. And I'm wondering just a general view from perhaps the panel who would like to throw in on that, because it's just about the philosophy of if you own a property, you should pay that. Whether you then add that into your charge for rent, that's sort of down to the market, but
it would be down to the market. And so first of all, it was Kate who mentioned that earlier, but it would be down to the market, and I would expect the pass-through to be close to 100%. That's how rents work.
Anyone else want to contribute on that? Ms. Willis?
I suppose I'd make rather a sort of dull administrative point there, that if you put it on owners, you need to know who all the owners are. And at the moment, we don't really have a comprehensive data on who owns all property. We know, the council tax, because council tax at the moment is on occupiers, not owners. And the land registry records everybody's legal title, but even that's not complete. So that there is an administrative challenge there.
Just finally, one last one, which is about these big houses, which are because we've probably got enough bedrooms in the country when we talk about supply, and that's on the taxation that homeowners are charged when they rent out a room to lodgers, for example. Kind of still quite, it's to keep the price low for the lodger, which I think is good, but I think more people could be taking the scheme up if tax didn't kick in at, I think it's about £7,000 a year. So once you're earning that, you then have to declare it. Just wondering if anyone has any views on that one. Just trying to get round of that thing about supply, more new homes versus the homes that we have.
Yes, thank you. I think it's important that threshold, which I think is currently just over 7,000, is uprated, because that hasn't changed for a number of years and probably doesn't reflect rents in areas. And then you get the complexities, as you say, of just going a bit above it, and then somebody's got to make a return. I think that would be looking at those thresholds would be a very good idea, and it's part of a good custody of the tax system, making sure that is a policy, achieving its policy intent of making people take up that.
Thank you for allowing me that digression, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. West. Jim Dixon MP.
Thank you, Dame Meg. One other idea that's out there that the Chancellor could decide to pick up, and it's been around for a while, is the idea of levying a charge on properties at the top end of the market. So it would fit Professor Leunig's notion of those with the broadest shoulders paying the most. So, for instance, a 1% levy on properties over £2 million at that threshold, otherwise dubbed a mansion tax in the past. Do we think such a tax would be fair? Kirstie Allsopp, do you think?
I think there'll be a lot more properties worth 1.9999 million. I think you'd see an extraordinary impact at that. And we have to bear in mind that across the board, one of the problems with stamp duty is the slabbing and the alteration it makes to prices at certain points. One of the things I find most upsetting about stamp duty now is that I used to be able to calculate it standing on my head. Now I have to go on the stamp duty land tax calculator because it has become so complicated that most buyers, even people with experience, can't do it. Yeah.
So there's potentially a practicality issue there. Yeah. How about a fairness issue, Professor Leunig? Do you have a
fairness is in the eye of the beholder. I'm not sure why someone who pays £2 million for a house should be taxed more than someone who spends half of that money on a house in the south of France, or on a yacht, or anything else. If you're going to have a wealth tax, you should have a wealth tax rather than isolating one form of wealth. I also think the cost of running it relative to the yield will be very high, because, as Richard will tell you, these are the hardest properties to value. They're also the people who have the best lawyers to contest the valuation. The amount of money you are likely to raise is going to be pretty small. It would not be number one on my list were I still to be advising the Chancellor on how to
160,000 homes would be over £2 million, and a 1% levy on a home that cost £3 million might get you £10,000 a year, I think, so 1% on the 1 million. Would that not be reasonable numbers ultimately for the?
I would have to go and Google the numbers, but again, the question is, if it's a slab side, if it's 2.1 million, are you levying it on all the 2.1 million, or are you just levying it on the 0.1? If you're only levying it on the 0.1, you really aren't going to be raising that much money at all. We might as well have a whip round this table.
Mr. Donald, what effect do you think that would have?
Well, if you're offering
Mr. Donald, what effect do you think that would have on the housing market?
Yeah, I don't think it's all about that tax, is it, on the whole or the part above? Because basically consumers will, or homeowners will simply consider what's the extra cost above the status quo today, and they will want to reflect that in the price they pay. And it might have a big impact on housing transactions. And at the very beginning we talked about how much money is made on stamp duty, which we're obviously saying we need to abolish, but on that end of the market. But it would distort the market from a transactions perspective. There's only about 1% of homes are over 2 million, so it's a very top end of the market. But again, it comes back to a point made by one of the committee members earlier about ability to pay. You know, is everyone in a 2 million home also at the top end of the income distribution, and then you get into whole deferral of taxes and things like that. So I agree with Tim. I think it might sound great, but actually it's not, for the effort and complexity involved, it's probably not going to generate much money.
Ms Willis, it passes your earlier tests of being easy to collect, hard to avoid, raising some revenue. Would you again feel this is something that the Chancellor should consider?
I think you would have to, again, going back to my systems point, you'd have to establish a new way of collecting that tax. So there would be a systems cost, and you'd have to establish ownership again of those properties. And I think, I suppose in terms of those criteria, public acceptability, I think there is often a fear of threshold creep. There is a tax, the annual tax on envelope dwellings, which taxes high-value residential property which are held in corporate structures, and that was originally designed to stop people enveloping their property, putting their property into a structure and then selling the shares, which a very low literally stamp duty rather than stamp duty land tax on selling your property, and that started off at 2 million. And it's now gone down to 500,000. Yeah.
Okay. So a mansion tax ruled out, I think, by the panel. So you all want stamp duty potentially to go. We obviously have Professor Leunig's idea of an annual property tax, but when we all think there are lots of problems with council tax, are there actually any property taxes that you think we ought to be entertaining? Because we're ruling a lot out here. I want Ms Willis.
Ms Willis may not be able to make. Yeah, Ms Willis may be able to talk the technical stuff. Ms Willis, we appreciate you don't have a political position.
No. Yes, exactly. I think I'd just go back to my general point that holistic reform, look at the taxes overall, but and the taxes individually, but you have to look holistically because they all affect each other.
Mr. John.
I think no, absolutely. I think for 15 years now, economists have been promoting a kind of let's shift to a proportional property tax basically and get away from transaction taxes. I do think Tim's paper probably deals with a lot of the kind of gnarly challenges of valuing expensive properties and cheap properties and then trying to get council tax covered off. There is a question about, your proposal does assume almost tax neutral on stamp duty, and so do we want to be tax neutral on stamp duty and shift the burden onto people over 500,000? Because again, to the point raised earlier, 70% of homes in London are over £500,000. So then you're really going to shift that sort of replacing stamp duty burden on homes in southern England. And then I think there's this big assumption of just because you live in a home, again, £500,000 is the average price of a property in London. It might be a lot of money, but that's the kind of reality. So I think it seems to me the right answer in the long term, medium term is a move to proportional property tax. But there's just some very big transitional challenges that present some real hurdles on sort of how do you take a delay to get to the right place in the medium term, or do we really need that money in the short term?
So I'll give two principles. The first principle is that property is the best basis for local taxes because it's the only thing that can't move out of an area. If we gave Reading the right to put a tax on petrol and it used it, all that we'd find is that people in Reading would buy their petrol just outside. Similarly, you can't have a local tax on cigarettes because it's levied at the warehouse, etc. The one thing that local areas, particularly small local areas, and British local authorities are much smaller than is typical abroad, can definitely levy as a property tax, and it needs to be regressive. And it needs to be regressive because otherwise Burnley has no tax base. And we shouldn't worry about the regressiveness of one tax, we should only worry about the regressiveness of the tax system as a whole. So that's why something akin to council tax, and I think my version is better, is a good local tax. But then we also need a property tax, because in the long run, if you don't have a property tax, you're going to have to tax income more, including VAT, which is a tax on income by remove. And that's a very bad incentive. And that's why, ideally, you'd have a land tax. But a land tax is very hard, and that's why I'm with Kirstie, who says we shouldn't tax people who improve their homes. We shouldn't want to tax property, we should want to tax land. That is every economist, and including Winston Churchill, the Merleys thing, all of us prefer, all true economists, as a hill to die on, will tell you they like land taxes. And stamp duty is a bad land tax. An annual tax on the value of your property is the best plausible approximation I could come up with to every economist's dream.
Ms. Allsopp.
I think we have to be very careful not to see buying property as a sin. Because at the moment, it's a sin tax. It's like cigarettes and alcohol and first-class travel. You are actually punished for wanting to buy a more expensive property than the previous one. And that is wrong. It should remain a positive, aspirational thing to want to have a better home for your family. And we should encourage it. We know, everybody tells you who's far more knowledgeable than me, that it is an economical positive to encourage people to move house. We also know that you should be able to easily move with rent. At the moment, if someone decides to rent their house for 5 years because they want to move nearer to their mother who's got dementia and is not going to live much longer, it's not practical to do that because that rent will be taxed, and therefore if they're renting the equivalent house in another part of the country, they won't be able to afford to do it. I think we need to look at the whole system from the perspective of, for the most part, these are people's homes, whether they're rented or they're bought, and we have to have a more positive attitude both to landlords and to people who want to buy properties.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Dixon. Yuan Yang, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Leunig, you've said just now that all sources of income should be taxed equally, in your view. There are many renters in Reading and across the country, like my younger brother, for example, who are paying higher effective rates of tax than their landlords, who do not pay, of course, NIC's national insurance contributions on their rental income that they earn from younger renters, by and large, like my brother. And I personally see this as partly an intergenerational fairness issue, given that landlords tend to be more of your category of age, Professor Leunig, and renters tend to be on the whole younger. Do you see this as a fairness or as an economic efficiency issue, and what would you propose to do about it?
So it's both, because as Kirstie said, it's rather odd that if you rent out one property and rent another one, you will be a loser. You can't offset that rental charge against, and that's why deep in my heart I would love to go back to Schedule A, where you would pay, you implied you were an owner-occupier, you would then pay rent on and you'd be able to offset the mortgage interest relief as you used to be. That isn't realistic. And so the second best thing is that NIC should be levied on all sources of income.
National insurance
contribution should in the main be levied on savings rates, pensions, income from letting out a house, and so on and so forth. And of course, that would allow other taxes to be reduced. And I think that's the important thing to understand, that when you broaden a tax base, you can cut the rate. So obviously someone could attack me for saying, Tim Leunig says, put NICs on pensions, just as I've also said we should put VAT on food. But the corollary of that is you can lower the rates across the board, you can have a simple flat system, and as Kate Willis constantly points out, the simpler the system, the better. So yes, absolutely. Fairness, though, I say again, when ministers used to ask the civil service, is this fair? We used to say, that's a question for you guys. That's your side of the table, not ours. Fairness is in the eye of the beholder.
Ms. Yang.
Professor Leunig, Mr. Donlan, you're smiling. I was wondering if you could comment on the impact of Professor Leunig's proposal on the market.
The tax base in front of us, but no.
What impact do you think such a proposal would have on the market?
I think I think that the challenge of the private rented sector is it hasn't grown for a decade since the introduction of reduced mortgage interest tax relief, higher stamp duty. So the private rented sector more than doubled in size between 2000 and 2016. It's gone sideways. The social rented sector has not grown in size for 30 years. So we have a static rental market in this country. The vast majority of private rented homes are owned by private landlords. And I think the real challenge is if we layer more cost onto private landlords, will they want to sell up properties basically and then reduce supply? Mm-hmm. And that impact is on lower to middle income renters basically, because the more you constrain supply, the more rents will go up. Now rents are rising at the lowest rate for 4 years. So I think, again, in the private rented sector, of course, we want to build more homes. We want to build more homes of all tenures. But I think the private rental market, and again, there's a loss of people on housing benefit in the private rental market as well, because we haven't grown the social rented sector. So I think anything that changes the decisions of private landlords about how they think about property, because again, 40% of private landlords don't have a mortgage. So it's not all about mortgages, it's about the broader costs, and their costs have just gone up a lot if you look at the data from HMRC.
Sorry, can I clarify one? Of course, as a true economist, I would allow them to offset the mortgage cost in full, and I would indeed allow them to offset the shadow mortgage cost if they don't have a mortgage, by the fact that they could have invested that money somewhere else. So I'm not saying I'm going to put up the tax burden, but the way the tax burden is currently structured is not especially economically literate.
Also,
I'm so sorry. I shouldn't address the question to Tim. But I presume that if he is proposing that we impose national insurance on pensions, he would also do the same to stocks and shares. And I think when you compare a rental investment as a landlord to a share portfolio, you have to pay capital gains on the sale of both, and you have to pay income tax on the what you get each year. Except when you have stocks and shares, you can sit on your arse 365 days of the year and do nothing, and you'll still get the money in. I think what we forget about landlords is they have to spend money maintaining those properties, looking after them, sorting out things for the tenants all the time. And we, in this country, I know it may not seem like it, but landlords actually do more to the properties than in France or Germany or Italy. We have a very different system by which the tenants are much less responsible for the maintenance of the properties than the landlords are. So I think when you seek to increase the burden for landlords, you have to be very careful to remember that it's not like other income streams. They have to maintain that physical element.
They're working for, as well
exactly.
It's not a passive investment.
It's not a passive investment.
Thank you. Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Yes, thank you, Chair. One last question, because you've been a fascinating panel, but it struck me that all of the conversation has been around assuming a finite stock of property, and everyone wants to see more homes built. So really my question is, what tax change in the property sector would have the biggest incentive to stimulating demand but also supply of new housing?
We start with Ms Willis. Have you got anything to say on that?
Yes, and I absolutely agree. Supply is crucial here. I think the tax barriers to supply, we've just written a paper on the tax barriers to supply, and there are a number of technical changes that we think which address obstacles in supply, and I'd be very happy to provide a copy of that paper too.
We would love a copy of that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mr Donald.
I think just done a big report actually on the viability of housing development, and I think the challenge for house builders is the cost of building has gone up 20% in 2 years, but sales values have only got 1%. In London, 50% on cost, 4% on prices, so there's a huge squeeze. And so I think in the coming budget, and again it's not a property tax, there's a landfill tax coming through that's going to potentially add a lot of money to every single home on top of all the other taxes. So we've got a lot of policy cost inflation coming through on top of rising materials and labour costs, and we haven't got house price inflation to pay for it all. So the kind of, I think it's challenging for a house builder to potentially buy a bit of land in about 60% of the country at the moment.
So the landfill tax threat
one
would
example,
be the one you would change.
One example.
That would, if you had to choose.
But there are others. Yeah. We've been sort of layering on cost on the sort of development of housing, and we probably need to start winding some of it back. I think that, and potentially that one not hitting is the first place to go.
Thank you.
So I'm going to assume that the landfill tax isn't going to happen because it's so obviously nuts and it will kill off building, particularly in London, because London creates a lot more spoil because you have to dig down to put the pilings in for flats. So that landfill tax is particularly a problem in London, and we will almost certainly get virtually no houses built if that goes ahead. And I think that was an error on the part of the Treasury, and I'm not expecting them to go ahead with that. It would be bizarre if they did. It won't raise any money either for that reason. The one I would say is stamp duty land tax. Most, particularly the big housing developers, will tell you you cannot build more houses than 1/10 of the number of houses that are sold in an area. Because there's a whole bunch of people who, for whatever reason, don't want to live in a new house. And therefore, the more flexible the market is, the more people sell who would be willing to buy a new house. So broadly speaking, if we can double the number of transactions of existing houses, we can double the absorptive capacity of new builds. And therefore, if you want to get Britain building, getting rid of stamp duty land tax would be a good way to do it.
Thank you. Ms. Allsopp.
I haven't got anything to add except from their mouth to God's ears.
It's a good place to stop then, Chair.
Well, can I just ask another couple of quick questions? So the timing of the payment of stamp duty land tax was, I think, one of our colleagues knows, very fast.
Yes.
Is there anything about that you would change, Ms. Allsopp? Does that make a difference to people?
It does make a difference. I think the thing we haven't talked about...
Well, I should say, so I think it's 2 weeks after...
It's very fast. I think it's 28 days.
Yes, so you have to have the cash the day you buy the house.
And you aren't allowed to borrow that money either. So that has... No. You.
But it's interesting. Our panel is clearly learning from each other. But yes. So Johnson, continue.
So I would. If you forgive me, I'd just like to say one thing. My taxi driver who brought me here, Vince, he's been a cabbie for 21 years. We just met when I got in his cab, originally from Belfast. His mother-in-law died 2 weeks ago. She had a house in Bromley, which was worth £650,000. She has left it to his brother-in-law and to his wife, with a 20% share to his 2 children, who are 35 and 25. Daughter's a head teacher, the son's a teacher. Neither of them own their properties at the moment. The elder one, because her marriage failed and she sold her home. The younger one, because he's 25. She has just found a new partner and done IVF, and she's 3 months pregnant. He's very excited about this. If either of those 2 people bought a home, they would have to pay second home stamp duty because of their share in the house that their granny left them 3 weeks ago. It is absurd. Just is absurd. Vince wants to buy out his brother-in-law and move into that house and leave his children with the 20% share that their granny intended them to have. I was the one who had to warn him that that wasn't a good idea if either of his children wanted to buy a home.
So there's a lot of people out there don't get advice because they're not expecting this sort of transaction.
And I didn't make up Vince.
No.
Vince exists. He was my taxi driver to bring me here to Portcullis House this afternoon.
Well,
I will
thank
add
you,
to that I was very surprised. Well, I knew nothing, of course, of Angela Rayner's housing affairs until it became public, but I read the stuff on gov.uk, and she seemed to me to be entirely compliant with the advice on gov.uk until you read the small print. And which of us ever reads the small print? So a tax system that does what it says on the tin should be welcomed. And I think here, as with Vince, and I don't claim any deep understanding, I've never met Angela Rayner or anything else, but if you can't live in the other house you're deemed to own, as is in the case here, then this house is not, in my view, a second home. A second home means there are 2 places you can choose to live unless you choose to rent it out. So I definitely think clarifying the rules on what is a second home to meet the common sense definition of a second home should also be a high priority for the defunct Office
What
of
about
Tax
the timings of paying this? Not something you know about? Or?
Well, I think from HMRC's point of view, they would be alarmed at any longer period because then people have moved in and can't pay, won't pay. I actually thought you had to pay on the day. And I should say in 1996, I did pay mine with a credit card because I took out a cash advance of the £1,300 that it was and gave it to my solicitor.
You may be able to pay with a credit card, but you can't include it in your mortgage.
In your mortgage.
Well, we're in danger of straying into advice and guidance, aren't we? Which is a Treasury.
Just for the record, I'm not a financial advisor and have not given any advice.
So just any quick points from Richard Donald, no, nothing to add. Kate Willis?
It's 14 days, reduced from 30 days a little while ago. I mean, I suppose I would say that it is a very efficient way of collecting tax because it's linked to the registration of the property and it's paid over immediately. You put in your return, you send it in and you pay your tax. So it is quite an efficient process. And it's there are other short-term payments like CGT for 60 days or second homes, which don't work so well because they're linked to legacy systems in HMRC, and they don't link together well. The SDLT one works pretty well.
Okay, so technically it's working for the
Technically it's working well, probably for the majority.
Okay, and then I think
something you said, there's a vote coming.
No, yes, so sorry, colleagues. Yes, apologies. And just very quickly to I think probably just to you, Professor Leunig, unless anyone's got anything to add. All of these things, we've had a good discussion. Thank you about all of the options, but this could take some while to do. Is it something that you think could be done in one budget?
If it was the centrepiece of the budget, you could do enough that was transferred. Or you'd never get all of it done, but you'd get a lot of it done in one budget.
Changes kicking in by next April? Some changes?
Yes, and ideally, of course, you don't want foreclosure.
Yes.
So ideally, you'd want the budget in March for this sort of thing, because you neither want people to delay for 5 months or for people to accelerate for 5 months. So
lots of interesting moving parts, but can I thank our witnesses very much. So did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say, I don't think we should underestimate the magnitude of system change.
Well, indeed, I think I spent over a decade looking at system change in the public sector and how much that can cost as well to the taxpayer. So, look, can I thank our witnesses enormously. I think the easy part, from what our panel have said from their point of view, is no one likes stamp duty, land tax. The hard part is what follows it. And what that means for council tax and income for the government to spend on public services. So perhaps it's not so much a question of location, maybe more a question of taxation. But can I thank our witnesses? That's Kate Willis from the Chartered Institute of Taxation, Richard Donnell from Zoopla, Tim Leunig from Public First Consulting, and Kirstie Allsopp, TV presenter and property expert. Thank you very much indeed for your time. The transcripts will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and thanks to our colleagues at Hansard for that. Order.